Welcome to Lead Well, Live Whole. I'm your host, Michael Sirmon. Every episode, we'll spend a few minutes exploring the challenges, questions, and realities of everyday life, because success means little if you lose yourself in the process. So take a breath, settle in, and let's spend a few minutes exploring life together. Welcome back to the Lead Well, Live Whole podcast. I'm Michael Sirmon, and every week we explore practical ideas to help you think clearly, lead confidently, and live whole. In the last episode, we talked about constructive confrontations, the courage to have the conversations most people avoid. But here's something I've learned over the years. Having the conversation is not the hard part. Living after the conversation often is. Have you ever replayed a difficult conversation over and over in your mind, wondering, did I say too much? Did I say enough? Did I make things worse? Or maybe you've had the opposite experience. You finally addressed an issue and nothing changed. If you've ever walked away from a difficult conversation unsure of what comes next, today's episode is for you. Because leadership isn't measured by how well you confront problems. It's measured by what you do after the conversation ends. There's this myth of a mythical finish line. And many of us treat difficult conversations like the finish line. I finally said what I needed to say. Check. Now let's move on. But healthy relationships don't work that way. One conversation rarely resolves years of misunderstanding. One conversation rarely rebuilds broken trust. One conversation rarely changes deeply rooted habits. Most meaningful change doesn't happen in a single moment. It can, but it's very rare. More often, it happens in the consistency that follows. Because leadership at work, at home, within yourself isn't event-driven, it's relationship-driven. After a conversation, it's typically followed by a period of silence. So sometimes the most uncomfortable part isn't the conversation, it's the silence afterwards. We begin to wonder what they're thinking. We wonder if they're angry. We wonder if they misunderstood or if they understood. And because that silence makes us uncomfortable, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, we start filling in the blanks. The story we tell ourselves is, they're upset, or, I think they're going to quit. In a personal relationship, you know what? They're never going to forgive me. They must hate me now. But the truth, most of the time, we don't know. We're writing stories with incomplete information to fill the silence in our heads. If episode 9 taught us to examine the voices we borrow, this episode reminds us not to become the narrator of someone else's thoughts. Right? So don't confuse silence with certainty. And above all, don't chase comfort. One mistake people often make is trying to immediately make everyone feel better. We apologize for telling the truth. We soften accountability. We lower expectations. We do the compliment sandwich where we praise them for something and then we give them something negative and then we praise them for something again. And they walk away confused, wondering what just happened. But why do we do that? We do that because discomfort in other people makes us uncomfortable as well. But healthy relationships don't rescue people from every uncomfortable emotion. In fact, growth often feels uncomfortable. I've said many times, you don't grow in a comfortable position. Conviction feels uncomfortable. Learning feels uncomfortable. So don't confuse temporary discomfort with lasting harm. Many of our children never learned to be responsible adults because we wanted to rescue them from every uncomfortable situation when they were children. They never learned the consequences or learned the strength required to work through what the challenge is because we did not want them to be uncomfortable. And it took a lot of years for me to learn that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is allow someone the space to wrestle with the truth. In fact, as a coach, one of the most difficult parts for me is to stay silent and let the client wrestle through whatever the challenge is so that they can create the space within their minds and within their thoughts to start hearing their own voice. And that way it's not someone coming from outside giving an answer, it's helping them come to the answer within themselves. So creating that space gives people room to respond. Because again, one conversation rarely tells the whole story, and everybody processes things differently. Some people need time to think. Some need time to respond immediately. Others need a day or two before they know what they really feel. So don't demand instant resolution. Instead, give people room. Give them room in the conversation. Give them room after the conversation. Because if we are approaching the conversation with grace, right? Grace doesn't remove accountability, but it does create the space for accountability to take root. And it's through our consistency that we begin to build credibility, right? Because here's where many people unintentionally lose trust. They have a difficult conversation and then they never follow up on it. Or they have the conversation and become hypercritical afterwards because they're not seeing what they thought they would see immediately. And neither of those approaches will work. Healthy discipline, healthy leadership is remarkably consistent, right? If we've established an expectation in someone else or within ourselves, follow up. If we've offered support, be available. If we promised accountability, keep our word. Because people trust leaders whose actions consistently match their words. In fact, people trust people whose actions consistently match their words. And trust isn't built in speeches, it's built in patterns. But one of the important things we have to do is separate the person from the problem, right? So one of the greatest gifts we can give another person is refusing to define them by their worst moment. And we've all had our bad moments. And if that's the thing that defined us, we would be of all men and women most miserable. A missed deadline is not someone's identity. A poor decision is not their identity. A failure in something is not their identity. So we correct the behavior. Whether it's somebody on our team, somebody in our family, or ourselves, we protect the dignity and then we encourage the potential. Because that's what great coaches do. Great coaches see people as becoming, not simply being. I think I shared a few episodes ago, one of Tammy and I, one of our affirmations is that our progress is not perfection. I'm sorry, that progress defines our day, not perfection, because it's a journey, right? So where I screwed up is our identity is defined by progress, not perfection, right? So that's how we define ourselves. We see people as becoming, not simply being. And if we can give other people that grace, we can give ourselves that grace. Because when someone knows that you still believe in them, they're far more willing to grow. They're far more willing to take a chance, right? We learned when our boys were teenagers, and even a little before that, was that it was important that we create an environment where they could fail safely, right? They could fail, but it wouldn't destroy them. They would feel the pain, they would grow from it, but it wasn't the end of the story. And just as with ourselves, we can't expect perfection in other people, because sometimes we have that conversation and sometimes the conversation goes beautifully. It's eloquent. It's textbook perfect, but sometimes it doesn't. People become defensive. Some people, people disagree. Some people, there's times people may walk away angry. Sometimes we may walk away angry, but that doesn't automatically mean the conversation failed. Because, again, success isn't measured by whether everyone smiles afterwards. Success is measured by whether people acted during and after out of honesty, with humility, with respect, with integrity. Again, and you'll hear me say this time and time and time and time again, we are responsible for our character, not someone else's response. I'm responsible for doing a podcast. I'm not responsible for making sure you listen to it. I'm responsible for maintaining and controlling my reactions, my behavior, right? In spite of what you do and how you act and how you behave, I get to control me, not you. Just as you control you, I don't control you. So one of the things that I really admire most about Jesus is that he never forced transformation. He invited it. He taught it. He corrected when it was needed. He challenged people, but he always loved. But he also allowed people to choose. even when that choice was for them to walk away. Because leadership is not about controlling the outcomes, especially in relationships, but it is about faithfully planting the seeds. And sometimes the seeds will grow immediately, but others are going to take time. Some won't grow at all. But your responsibility is not to make them grow. It's in the faithful planting, watering, nurturing, not controlling. In Galatians 6:9, we're encouraged with these words. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we don't give up. Now, these words aren't just about serving, they're also about relationships. Don't become weary because growth takes time. Don't assume today's conversation is the end of the story, because sometimes it's simply the beginning. I want to challenge you with this. Think back to the last difficult conversation you had and ask yourself, what does this relationship need from me now? Does it need encouragement? Does it need a follow-up conversation? Does it need clear expectations? Does it need an apology? Does it require my patience or simply my prayer? Or maybe it just means I have to stay consistent, right? With our children, with our spouses, with our friends, with our jobs, and with our teams that report to us. Because leadership doesn't end when the conversation ends. Sometimes that's where leadership truly begins. And the goal of confrontation was never to win. It was never to prove a point. It was never to have the last word. The goal has always been restoration. It has always been growth. It has always been about building trust and healthier relationships. So some conversations change people overnight, but most don't. Most are simply the first step in a much, much longer journey. So don't become discouraged if change feels slow, because growth happens underneath the surface long before anyone sees the harvest. So keep showing up, keep telling the truth with grace, keep believing the best in people, be consistent, and remember, great leaders aren't remembered because they had difficult conversations. They're remembered because people were better after having them. So thank you for joining me for another episode of Lead Well, Live Whole. If today's conversation encouraged you, I'd be honored if you would like, subscribe, follow, and share it with someone who may need to hear it. If you'd like to explore more leadership insights, articles, coaching resources, and podcast episodes, visit Lead Well, Live Whole or michaelsirmon.com. Until next time, think clearly, lead confidently, develop others, and above all, live whole.